Tēnā katoa. This morning, I'm preaching on another parable, this one from Matthew 18. The text starts at verse 21. It's about forgiveness. For the past 2 Sundays, I've been preaching on parables most likely told by Jesus. On July the 19th, I spoke about the parables of the mustard weed and unclean bread, pointing to the Jesus vision of normative barriers like religious holiness, class, gender, race, no longer functioning or necessary. The myth back then and now is that we need barriers keeping the other, the unclean, out in order to be safe and clean ourselves. But Jesus subverted that myth, preaching and practicing an inclusive fellowship as a microcosm of how he envisaged all the world could be. Last Sunday, I told the treasure parables about a field and a pearl and how they subverted the myth of seeking monetary or spiritual wealth. Contrary to that myth then or now, there is no value, no individual gain in following Jesus, no individual gain in God's empire. By identifying with the losers in the loser empire of God, we become, in the eyes of the world, losers too. Most of these parables, like today's parable, Mark Davis calls ridiculous forgiveness and reasonable evil. Most of these parables were fashioned by a later editor who either didn't understand the original or more probably wanted to interpret its message differently. The first thing to understand about this forgiveness parable is the myth behind it. It's a little complex because kings and emperors were generally not seen in a good light by Palestinian peasants. Kings and emperors were at the pinnacle of the oppressive political and economic structure, and their lackeys made life miserable, usually through excessive taxation and violent enforcement. Forget the benign open public buildings of firm altruism monarchy that you and I are used to. But in the Hebrew scriptures, there are references to God being a hierarchical king over all the earth, Psalm 47. And there are references to God being the ultimate judge, Isaiah 33. And in the first half of the parable, where a man owing a great deal of money and unable to pay is sentenced to have his family sold into slavery, but when pleading is miraculously forgiven. This would fit into that myth of a divine, kingly judge exercising mercy. We, I hope, have a niggling problem about God selling people into slavery. Yet my point is that behind the parable is a myth of a just, merciful King God ruling over the earth that not just pervades this story, but much of Christian theology and history. It is this myth that has God atop a pyramid of power. It's this myth which shapes forgiveness as something the powerful do for the powerless. And when the powerless do not behave properly, it's this myth that promotes the idea that God would send those people to punishment. It is this myth about God and forgiveness that I think the historical Jesus was subverting. The theme of the parable is set by the story of Jesus and Peter. Peter asking, how many times should I forgive? 70 times 7? And it is about economic forgiveness. As a strict translation of the Lord's Prayer would say, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are in debt to us. Forgiving debt means writing off the debt. The context is the crippling nature of debt in the lives of the peasant classes of first century Palestine. It's not unlike someone today who's borrowed money from a finance company in order to pay their weekly rent, with, say, the rent money having to be spent on an urgent medical need. And then that person gets into a debt spiral. There's this destructive confluence of low wages or benefits, high rents, poor health, poor education, and increasing indebtedness. As an aside, this debt spiral is what the work of Aotearoa Development Cooperative, ADC, which originated here at St. Luke's, tries to address in Myanmar through microfinance support. The telltale sign in this parable that Jesus is subverting the myth of a kingly judge God is verse 34. When the man who was originally forgiven by his master or lord, this man goes, demands, and does not forgive a much smaller debt owed to him. When his lord hears about it, he says, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you have not had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. The torture word. We might imagine, in the wake of the times and Christian history, when we have condoned and followed the example of a torturing deity, that this was normative in Judaism. Far from it. This torturing deity, to the mind of the first century Jewish audience, is like an oriental tyrant, not the true God of Israel at all. Another problem with our parable, in addition to having a king God who judges, who tortures, is that unlike Jesus' words to Peter about forgiving 70 times 7, this king just forgives once and then takes back that forgiveness already offered when the slave fails to forgive the one indebted to him. While this type of tyrannical king is not atypical of the rulers of empire, it's not the Jesus vision. Earlier in chapter 5 of Matthew, there is a non-judgmental Jesus who says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. So the audience of this parable can discern that Jesus' vision of God's empire is not the vision of this parable. It's not oppressive, does not deal in self-serving pity. I'll come back to that in a minute. And it does not forgive just once and then revoke it. Rather than reflect the empire of God, this parable is a contrast to it. It is subverting the normative myths about God and forgiveness. Let me tell you about that self-serving pity. The Bible commentator Warren Carter points out verse 26, where the slave prostrates himself before the anointed king, indicates the slave's willingness to submit to the king's authority and therefore satisfy the king's honor. Thus the king has pity, verse 27, and changes his mind. But the pity is vastly different from the mercy we've seen in Jesus' actions in some of the stories in the Gospels, actions which transform and benefit a desperate person. The king's pity is calculated for the king's benefit. The king is a predatory lender who keeps slaves in his debt by lending them lots of money. The slave, after prostrating himself, is now even more indebted to the king and more easily controlled. The slave's skill and network are not lost to the king. Forgiveness, so called, from the king is forgiveness with the controlling puppeteer strings still attached. This parable, read uncritically, endorses a theological and economic top-down system of retributive justice and laying the imprimatur of God on it. It's paternalistic, which means that mercy is shown at the whim of the highest authority. Mercy is given and taken away to maintain control. The king controls the slave who finds another slave to control. It's a system which, like ours, is a hierarchy with a reward and punishment foundation and prison as the ultimate method of social control. It's a story about a world like ours where more often than not there is no happy ending. It is, to come back to that phrase of Mark Davis's, reasonable evil. Conversely, the Jesus vision of ridiculous forgiveness subverts hierarchy and paternalism by saying the greatest among you is a child. So the greatest is not a kingly judge atop a pyramid of power, but a powerless and vulnerable child. God is more like a child than a king, a weak force, as Jacques Derrida or John Caputo would say. Like love, like forgiveness, weak. This is Jesus deconstructing our thinking about kings and gods and forgiveness. Peter asks, how often should I forgive? 7 times? Jesus responds, 70 times 7. This is hyperbole, indicating an infinite number of times. Forgiveness, like love, like grace, is not something that a king or a god measure out when we meet certain conditions. Forgiveness is not 490 boxes that an accountant god or an accountant church is keeping tally of, counting how many times we've screwed up and whether we've truly been remorseful. No, forgiveness is more like the air of unconditional acceptance that we breathe in a Jesus world. Forgiveness is a given in a Jesus world. You do not have to ask for it. It just is. Forgiveness is free. It is, again using Mark Davis's term, ridiculous forgiveness. Note, this is the only Jesus parable with a king and with an allusion to God in it, whereas kings were quite common in other rabbis' parables. So while the kingdom or empire of God is a principal theme for Jesus, he doesn't prefer kings as models for his kingdom. A top-down dispensary of grace is contrary to the notion of grace as the air we breathe and are empowered by. The challenge in the Jesus world is how to heal each other's wounds, our own wounds, and the wounds of the most vulnerable. Or in other language, the challenge is to build and restore the well-being of the human community. How then do we translate this Jesus vision of economic forgiveness in order that it has relevance to those in poverty and in indebtedness today? While the text is critical of top-down retributive justice and the creation of a God king in that image, what would restorative justice and the healing of economic wounds look like in our poorest communities? And what would a God created in that image be like? How are the indebted and despairing among us empowered? This parable is a critique of those who equate both God and anointedness. Remember that anointedness was messiahship and Christlikeness. It's a critique of those who associate it with top-down power. It deconstructs the God, then, of most of our upbringings. It's also a critique of the accounting mode of forgiveness. I'll forgive you if you forgive others, or if you're sorry enough. But Jesus' forgiveness is free. Can you believe it? Can you live it? And lastly, the parables are a critique of trying to organize our society, our churches, on the top-down model of empire, with the powerful dispensing favors to the powerless. The alternative empire of God is premised on a different model of power, debt, forgiveness, and grace. This empire, ridiculously, has a vulnerable child at its center. Blessings to you this week.